Chapter 20, Living in the Gap. Let us begin with a reading from William Johnston's Being in Love. When Jew and Christian, Hindu and Buddhist, Muslim and agnostic come together for prayer, the world will listen, and God will listen too. Whether our model is used within the Catholic tradition or outside of it, one of its key features must be to help directees live in the gap between vision and reality and help them find concrete ways of narrowing the distance between the two. And to achieve this, directors need to be sensitive to the different attitudes that their directees might have about the ideal they are striving to realize in their lives, and help them to identify the gap, name it, take ownership of it, and accompany them in a search for practical ways of living in the gap and narrowing it. So first we have to look at our various attitudes towards the vision. Survey Pinckaers, in his book, The Sources of Christian Ethics, helps us to understand, for example, the different attitudes that Christians have towards Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, which is delineated in chapters 5 through 7 of the Gospel of Matthew. He says that one interpretation views the sermon merely as a series of counsels rather than commands, and hence do not apply to everyone. Another sees it as an impossible ideal that is designated to inspire and goad us on to achieve as much of it as we can. Yet another claims that it represents an interim morality to be lived during what the early Christian thought was to be a short interval of time between Christ's first and second coming. Another interpretation considers it as a means of social transformation to be carried out literally through peaceful, nonviolent means. And still another says that its primary function is to make us aware of our sinfulness and thus lead us to renewed faith and repentance. What's important here that I'd like to emphasize in the Christian ideal is that regardless of the vision, we can have many attitudes toward it and what that vision means. And I think this can also be applied to members of other religious, philosophical, and ethical traditions. You can take Christ out of it, but ask ourselves, whatever is the vision a particular tradition has, some may think that the vision or ideal in question is not universally applicable, but only for a select few. Others may see it as an unreachable goal, designated and designed only to inspire. Still others may view whatever vision they have, they may view it as something that could be practiced only for a short while. And still others may take it literally and consider it to be universally applicable. Others may look at what the ideal tells them about themselves and how much they fall short of it, of making it the ideal a reality in their lives. And it is also quite possible for a person to have a number of different, perhaps even conflicting attitudes towards the vision or ideal in question. So one of the ways that directors can help serve those coming to them for guidance would be to help them not only identify what their ideal is, but what are the attitudes that they have towards the ideal and their ability to embody it. In doing so, their directees would be in a better position to look at how they can take better ownership of their ideal and allow it to shape their lives in both implicit and explicit ways. For this reason, a gap will always exist between the official teaching of a particular tradition and how people have embraced it and make it their own. And the job of spiritual direction is to identify the ideal, to identify their attitude towards the ideal, to help them then identify the gap between the ideal and their reality, and then to take practical steps to narrowing the ideal as best as possible. So let us look at identifying the gap. In order to name and take ownership of the gap that exists between the vision and reality, directees need to make a realistic assessment of their present situation. Only then can an adequate assessment of the distance between the ideal and the real come about. Since people can be very skilled in the art of self-deception, they often need the help in arriving at such valued judgments. Spiritual directors can be just the ones to help them view themselves as they really are. And in the process, if it's going to continue, to taking a clear-eyed look at one's vision or ideal of ultimate concern is not enough. In addition to this accurate assessment of their lives, they need to take a look at their values, practices, and styles of living. A solid understanding of the moral and spiritual values it proposes. They also need to find out if they have watered down those values in any way, and if they have actually held any of them explicitly contrary to their ideals. Much of spiritual direction involves helping directees uncover whatever hidden values they hold that may actually go against their deepest held values and beliefs. People express their values in life through concrete practices. And so the idea here is to identify the gap, identify how they are living in the gap, and help them to find ways in which they can narrow that gap so that they can draw closer to the ideal. Once directees have made an honest assessment of their lives, they are in a position to confront the distance in their lives between their ideal vision of the moral life and their concrete circumstances. And at this point, directors should encourage the directees to understand that, at least in the present life, there is always going to be a discrepancy between the vision and reality in their lives. But be that as it may, the gap can be diminished by means of small incremental practices that foster different ways of thinking and acting. The goal here is always to meet people where they are and help them to see what possible steps could be taken that will narrow the gap and move them closer to their ideal. Directors can also help their directees by helping them to discover useful strategies for living in the gap between the ideal towards which they are striving. And then we move to practical resolutions. After one's focus of ultimate concern has been duly contemplated, and after a thorough assessment of one's current situation is made, and the distance between the ideal and the real in one's life is calculated, directees can look at what concrete practical steps they can take to narrow the gap between vision and reality in their lives. And directors can help them in a number of ways. Probably the most important thing they can do to meet them, those coming to them, where they are. Directors need to rid themselves of any false ideas they may have about where the directees should be in their journey along the moral and spiritual life. They must listen attentively to their directees to help them get in touch with the various needs that they have identified during their assessment of the gap between vision and reality. They can meet them where they are by offering them a safe, non-threatening place to share what is actually on their minds. Intimacy, we must remember, comes from self-disclosure and loving attention. The relationship of spiritual direction should be based on a level of intimate trust that allows both of these aspects to surface. Only from this basic understanding of trust can directees share their authentic concerns with their directors and look for the next practical steps they need to make. And flowing from this trusting relationship comes the work of prudent reflection on what can be done and implemented to narrow the gap between vision and reality living in their lives. Our model of spiritual direction is eminently practical. It encourages directees to take control of their lives by identifying practical steps to help them deal with their concerns and troubles. Our model embraces a spirituality of practice, regardless of this religious, philosophical, or ethical tradition to which they belong. Directees should be encouraged to live in the gap they have identified in constructive, practical ways. This means trying to name useful and realistic means that will bring them closer to their desired end. Directors should advise their directees to integrate their prioritized list of concrete steps into their daily lives. Directees should be encouraged to start out slowly by adding only 1 or 2 practical steps into their daily routine. And only after these steps have been successfully integrated into their lives should they consider taking and adding further steps into their program. The goal here is to add gradually, over time, a series of small incremental steps that will narrow the distance between vision and reality and make their ideal more visible in their lives. It requires patience, long-suffering. Living in the gap largely means setting out on a journey and being determined to finish it. It presupposes that one's destination, by means of a steady application of small, clearly identifiable practices that always meets people where they are and then encourages them to move closer towards their goal by taking the next small incremental step. It's what it's all about. Let us have some observations about this idea of helping directees to live in the gap between vision and reality. To begin with, we should state out front that those who hold a completely subjective and relativistic worldview will benefit little from our model of direction. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but the danger of what some call emotivism or what others call the dictatorship of relativism shifts the focus from the external objective good to the internal subjective self. And as a result, this common patrimony represents a kind of natural revelation in the moral order, has been collected by a number of places, and it should be used in conjunction with sacred texts to help people identify what is the ultimate value, the ultimate reality to which they are called. Also, along the way, directors should help their directees assess the progress they are making to live in the gap between vision and reality and gradually narrow it. If directors are going to be of help to their directees, it is also important that they seek to live in and narrow the gap between vision and reality in their own lives by participating in the direction process themselves, receiving ongoing formation in spiritual direction, and by seeking ongoing supervision. When helping directees to seek adequate means to live in the gap and to narrow the distance between vision and reality, directors should also encourage them to look at how they compare themselves with others. Each person is on a unique journey and needs to take into account their unique personalities and current limitations. Living in the gap between vision and reality also requires accurate assessments of the directee's moral ideals and attitudes toward it, their commitment to it, their failure to embody it in the daily life of their commitment to narrowing it, and the practical means they have found for doing so. In addition, to be realistic and practical, directors should encourage their directees to be hopeful. Doing so means helping them to keep their eye on the goal, while at the same time encouraging them to take practical steps to get there. And finally, in addition to be realistic and hopeful, directors should encourage their directees to befriend their imperfections with the view of one day outgrowing them. To conclude, although our model of spiritual direction has developed out of the Catholic tradition, and more particularly from within the moral and spiritual vision of St. Alphonsus de Liguori, It can be adapted to those coming from other religious, philosophical, and ethical traditions. This adaptation is not a watering down of the model, but an accommodation to the sensitivities of others so that they may benefit from the underlying dynamics of the process. One important feature here in this process is the importance of helping directees to live in the gap between vision and reality, between their ideal of the moral life and the way in which they manifest it in their daily lives. Doing so does not mean becoming disillusioned with one's ideal and simply settling for a lesser, perhaps more attainable embodiment of it, but being at one and the same time focused on the vision as the goal of one's life's journey and taking practical steps towards achieving it. Such an approach involves a subtle mixture of idealism, realism, and resolute planning. It focuses on matters of ultimate concern. Let us conclude with some reflections. Why is it important to be aware of our attitude towards the ideal life? How does this attitude affect what we think, say, and do? Why do people give up on their ideals? How can spiritual direction help us identify the gap between vision and reality in our lives? How can it help us live in the gap?